segment, Tom goes into further detail on the close, whether you're closing to one decision maker or an entire group. In group situations, he shows you how to decipher the group's dynamics and focus your efforts on both the stated and the unstated leaders of the group. Now pay attention as Tom gives you specific closing phrases. You'll probably want to use these powerful closes word for word. Next, Tom addresses something every salesperson faces each and every day. That's objections. Tom tells us that not all questions are objections, and there is a way to determine a genuine objection from a stall. He then teaches how to use objections as buying signs, where you have a chance to sell your product or service again and then close multiple times after each objection has been addressed. Remember what Tom says, it's that persistence through obstacles that will cause you to be successful. Did you know that most buyers have what's called a buying ritual? Well, Tom explains what that ritual is and how to get past it and flush out real objections from the unreal objections.
How do you close groups? Who do you ask to sign? There's an art to group closing. In the banking business, most decisions are made by group consensus. One sale I'm very proud of was to a large savings and loan company in Oklahoma. I presented our product to the marketing director. He gathered the management of the bank for a group presentation. In the group presentation, the CEO was skeptical. When it came time for the decision, I looked at the CEO and said, since Bill, who was the marketing director, is so convinced this will work, let's let him sign the agreement. And I proceeded to push the contract towards the marketing director, Bill. And he did his part and signed it. What happened there? This is called neutralizing the negative influence. Many salespeople fail to identify the negative influence in a group situation and thereby lose control of the group. One negative person in a group can mean failure. Most salespeople have seen that happen. However, if you identify the negative influence, you can neutralize it and close with the positive influence. In the book business, the typical sales situation consisted of a husband and wife sitting on the couch together. I sat across from them on my sample case, and 6 out of 10 times the husband was negative while the wife was positive. I engaged both throughout the presentation, but when it came time to close, I directed my questions to the wife. One negative influence doesn't equal a non-sale. It only takes one yes to close a sale. Gentleman Jim Corbett, the fighter, was asked how he became a world champion. His response? You fight one more round. One skill that's important in closing a group presentation, let's just say 12 people or less, is to know their names. When I sit down to make a group presentation, I take out a blank sheet of white paper and I write their names down around the diagram of the table. Then I use every name a couple of times during my presentation. Closing the sale when more than one person is present is more difficult than a one-on-one close. You must build enough of a group consensus to get them over the edge, even if not all the group is positive. This is accomplished largely by the use of their names and recognizing who must be sold. In every group, there's a formal and an informal leader. Even in groups of 2, one will be the leader and the other is the informal leader. Both of these leaders must be sold before you close. Leadership is assumed, not assigned. Truthfully, there will be an assigned leader. But there will also be someone who is assuming some degree of leadership. If you watch, that dynamic will make itself known quickly. Use this to help you close with the group. Here's one of my favorite group closes. I've used it successfully hundreds of times. As the presentation draws to a close and the trial closing answers weren't 100% positive, or if I had any doubt that I could close immediately after the presentation, at the end of the presentation I'd say, now what I'll do is step out of the room and let you make a decision while I wait. I would stand up as I was saying this so I'd get no resistance from the group, and I kept moving toward the door. As I walked out, I'd add, take as long as you need, and if you have a question, I'll be right outside. This close almost always worked to get a decision. About 9 out of 10 times with this close, the decision I got was a yes. Don't forget that's your goal, to get a decision. Back to the basics of closing. In closing situations, I've seen lots of salespeople launch their own torpedoes against themselves. Of course, the biggest barrier was not having a planned close. Get a sentence or two that you feel comfortable with, memorize it, and use it over and over again. There was a man who owned a vegetable stand, and he hired an immigrant to run one of the vegetable stands that was new. The man couldn't speak English, so the man taught the immigrant to say 3 things. That was his canned close. The owner told the man, first, people will ask you how much are they. You say to them, 2 for $5. The owner continued, Then they'll ask, are the ones on the bottom as good as the ones on the top? And you be honest and you answer that question. Some are and some aren't. And then the owner told the immigrant his third memorized response. If they don't buy, they'll say something like, I guess I don't want any. And you say, if you don't, somebody else will. Well, a man walked up to the stand and asked for directions. The immigrant said, 2 for $5. The man replied, is every vendor as stupid as you? And the immigrant said, some are and some aren't. The man who'd asked for directions was really mad at this point and said, I should just punch you in the nose. And with that, the immigrant replied, if you don't, somebody else will. Well, unless you want to punch in the nose, don't use a canned close like this, but get a good canned close to use when it's time to close. Here are some ideas for a basic good canned close. Using positive body language, reach for a contract, a customer information sheet, or anything you have to fill out and say, now if I can just get some information from you, we can get started. This is a form of the order book close that I explained earlier. Anything that gets you writing will bring the prospect to a point of decision. Another good close is, let's go ahead and set a date now. And you do this while reaching for your calendar, either electronic or paper. And again, positive body language and the assumptive close are both used here. If you need to soften your closing questions so that the prospect doesn't feel railroaded, then add these words. Mr. Jackson, if you were going to do this, when would you start? Again, reach for your calendar as you say this, or say, Mr. Jackson, if you were going to move forward, we need to set a date. Let's take a look at our calendars. Out of thousands of salespeople at Morgan Stanley Dean Witter, my stockbroker is always among the top 100. Here's her simple close. I need to get your current account information in order to move your account. Then she starts writing. It's a classic order book close that moves millions of dollars under her control. Have a canned close, and if you plan on closing more than once, you also need to have more than one obligating question. I've interviewed thousands of salespeople for sales positions, and one question I like to ask is, what is your current closing question? I've found only about 1 out of every 100 actually have a canned closing question. No wonder they're looking for a job. I've never understood why something so obvious is missed by so many. Salespeople also set up barriers for themselves through failure to use positive body language. When you take action, it's hard to slow your momentum. At the moment of decision, the prospect has doubts and fears, but your confidence can overcome this many times. A prospect that's teetering on the brink of a yes can be tipped favorably with your positive body action. Reach for an order book, a calendar, your laptop, anything that physically assumes the sale is closed. Another barrier that salespeople place in their way is not knowing when to close. At the end of our discussion on the presentation, the concept of overselling was introduced. Far too many people oversell and never close. Here's my rule of thumb. If you're repeating yourself, it's time to close. Don't repeat yourself. It's proof of every flaw we've discussed. No planned sales talk, no planned close, no confidence, no salesmanship in general. One of the greatest salesmen I know, a man worth several $100 million, called to ask me for a political donation. He told me his whole story twice and never actually asked for a specific amount. I gave him $1,000 so I wouldn't have to hear the story a third time. It just goes to show you that even great salespeople can be ineffective if they don't use the tools of the trade. However, I will add this, that the man did get a donation, principally because he called. It's good to remember what Woody Allen said, 95% of success is showing up. It seems to me that many salespeople invite the stall into both their presentation and their close by how they answer the customer's questions. For example, the prospect says, do you have some information you can leave with me? The average salesperson says, yes, and when I get done, I'll leave you some brochures. The great closer says, yes, but I'm going to give you all the information you need to make a decision today. You'll know when I'm done whether this meets your needs or not. Here's another example. The prospect says, do you have some references I can call? The average salesperson's response would be, yes, I'll leave you some when I'm done. The great salesperson says, yes, in a moment we can look at some reference letters together. Both responses from the average salesperson told the prospect indirectly that he did not have to make a decision. But the responses given by the great salesperson let the prospect know indirectly that he was expected to make a decision then. Your demeanor and the way you answer prospects' questions will also help you close. The sale starts when you hear an objection. Up to that point, you're really just exchanging information. It's at the point of an objection that a salesperson's work really begins. I worked with one salesman, Jim Samuels, who said he could sleep through the presentation, but he woke up for the close and to answer objections. That analogy is a bit extreme, but the point is a good one. You must prepare yourself to reclose 2, 3, 4, 5, or 12 times after each objection, and you must prepare yourself to determine the real objections from the questions. Is the prospect objecting or just searching for more information? Every question is not an objection. Every objection is not real. Every real objection is not an objection to buying, and every objection is not spoken. Have I confused you? I think I confused myself. First, we need to identify types of objections and differentiate them from questions. When a prospect asks a question that may be interpreted as a potential objection, answer the question as directly as possible. I worked with a great salesperson who believed every question was the beginning of an objection. So instead of answering the question directly, he answered the anticipated objection. And he and the prospect ended up frustrated. And frankly, it frustrated me watching him. Don't try to preempt the objection. Don't try to anticipate the objection. Just answer the question. Now, the one exception I make to this, and the only one, is if I'm going to cover the question that was asked in my planned presentation, then I might say, I'm going to cover that in just a second. Let me explain this first. Other than that, I answer the question. For example, if the prospect says, has anyone ever canceled your program? I respond with, sure, we have cancellations, but let me show you this. Most of the time, questions are really buying signs. Real objections are different than questions. The best time to answer an objection, as we said before, is before it comes up. Translation, the answers to objections should be built into your presentation. In the book business, I didn't come back to a house a second time. Once I gave the presentation, that was it. The expected objections were, I want to think about it, or can you come back and show it to my spouse? So in anticipation of those objections in the setup, I'd say, since I'm only going to stop at every house once, is there anybody else at home we should show these to? I answered the objection before it came up. There is the spoken objection, and it can be both real and unreal. In the banking world, the unreal spoken objection we classified as a stall. Here's an example that I'll use later on in these DVDs. I'd like to ask the board of directors about it. What the prospect was really saying was, I am not sold, but I don't want to tell you my real objection. Most bank CEOs could make a decision about anything I was selling, so that objection was not real. It was just a stall. And there will often be an objection voiced that is not really an objection. What is the real voiced objection? Here's a perfect example. In the banking business, prospects would say, we're in the middle of a merger with another bank, and I can't make that decision now. Now that was a real objection. The most interesting objection is the unspoken objection. The prospect is keeping a secret from you. It may be real, it may be illusionary, it could be almost anything. For the salesperson, it's the most frustrating. But it can be dealt with, and I'm excited to share with you how to do this. I want you to have this attitude when you hear an objection. Now the work begins. I know the answers better than the prospect knows the objections. When the prospect voices an objection, let's assume that it's not a real objection, it's a stall. First, you must acknowledge the objection and remember in your mind that you believe this is not a real objection. The best and only way to do this respectfully, even when you know exactly what your response is going to be, is to first pause and then answer. This is applicable to real life, not just in the selling world. If one of your friends expressed a real concern to you, you would think about it a moment and then speak. This distinction is important. Amy Golden went to Brown University and graduated with honors. She was accepted to both Harvard and Kellogg's MBA program. She was the smartest salesperson I've ever worked with. She was attractive, she knew our product, and she knew our sales presentation better than anyone else. And yet she was a mediocre performer. Her numbers were always just okay. I watched her on a few sales calls and immediately I saw the problem. Before the last word of the prospect's objections even left their mouth, she was answering them. She was smarter than the prospects, and they could sense it. They could even feel it. There was no respect, no knowledge, and no acknowledgement of the objection. When Amy realized what she was doing, she changed and became a top producer. Once you've respectfully listened to the objection, you must give the prospect the answer. A word of caution here. The more credibility you give the objection, the more credibility the prospect will give it. Therefore, if you believe the objection is less than sincere, don't give it much credibility. Here's a good response to the "I need board approval" stall I introduced at the beginning of this discussion. I know how you feel. I think a lot of bankers who've bought our program felt the same way. One feature that I forgot to mention is this. After responding, explain another feature or amplify one that was already mentioned, and then close again. If the same objection is given a second time, answer it. This response acknowledges the objection, lets the prospects know that you understood how they feel, and tells them that they are not alone. It then lets the prospects know that many other people have bought despite this objection. Then the program is resold so that you can close again. Remember, you aren't allowed to close again without giving the prospect some additional information. If you do, you deserve the title high-pressure salesperson. It's surprising how many prospects won't repeat their objections a second time, and that's because those objections are really just stalls. The stall is just that, stalling because of a hesitation or unwillingness to come to a decision. And it's probably worked on dozens of other salespeople, but it doesn't have to work on you. In order to treat the stall as I've described, you must be prepared for it. You must have a specific feature that will illustrate a benefit, ready to show and explain to the prospect when the stall is given. The steps to overcoming a stall are these. First, acknowledgement. Second, additional information, feature benefit. Third, a second close with an obligating question. The important thing is to have something ready. In the book business, this additional information was another section of the books I sold with questions that illustrated benefits. In the banking world, I used actual case studies of the banks I worked with and demonstrated how our program was working for them. To be prepared for this approach to answering objections, you must have a new obligating question or series of questions. In selling to banks, my second close was this. Mr. Jackson, if you implemented our program, how soon would you want to start? And I would reach for my calendar, or I'd open it up. Another question I used was, who will be in charge of the program, you or someone else? This technique is called alternative choice. In the door-to-door book business, my second close looked like this. Like I said, I'll bring the books back myself at the end of the summer. Or I do have a set in the car if you want to get them today. Would you just as soon get them today as to wait? Again, this is an example of the alternate of choice closing technique. If the prospect repeats the stall a second time, you must answer the objection as if it were a real one. Chances are it is, and you simply misjudged the prospect's sincerity the first time. The real spoken objection, the grand poobah. For this objection, use the technique that's been taught by all the greats for at least 50 years. Feel, felt, found. I don't know who labeled it that. It may have been Zig Ziglar, but before I ever heard that label, my sales managers at the Southwestern Company were teaching me the concept. Now I've taught it to thousands of salespeople as well. It starts with acknowledgement of the objection. Mr. Jackson, I know how you feel. Other people in the same situation have felt the same way. However, here's what they found. Then answer the objection. You can make this answer much stronger through the use of names and specific examples. In place of other people, use real situations and real people the prospect knows. For example, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Stevens, and Mrs. Carter all felt the same way before they bought. Here's what they found. The third-party influence is powerful here, just as it is in the approach, the setup, the presentation, and the close. When you answer an objection, you must not sound like you're in control, even if you are, and you should be. You must think to yourself, I am on the same side of the desk as my prospect. I am sitting beside my prospect, not confronting him with the fact that his feelings are wrong, immature, or just plain stupid. Once again, we must create a buying atmosphere. You can accomplish this by restating the objection in this way. Mr. Jackson, I wouldn't want you to do this if it were too expensive. However, here's what other bankers like Mr. Carter found. When you tell your prospect you wouldn't want him to buy your product if it was not right for him, you gain credibility. There is a natural tension, as we've said before, between salesperson and prospect. And when you say this, it reduces this inherent tension and actually makes the tension work in your favor. Many times after my response to an objection, I've heard a prospect say something like this: "No, it's not that, it's just that." If you have the courage and discipline to use it, you will amaze yourself by using a technique called negative selling. Here's an example of that technique. "Mrs. Jackson, I wouldn't want you to get it if you couldn't afford it. But it's like Mrs. Jones said. You answer the objection by letting other people be the bad guys. It is very hard to argue with a story. Prospects can deny your opinion, but they can't deny what really happened to a peer or friend. They can't fault you, after all. You don't want them to buy unless it's in their own best interest." In the book business, the prospect would say, "I just don't know if my kids would read them." And there was never a truer or more sincere objection. My answer was not, "Get them anyway, I need the commission." Instead, my answer was this: "Mrs. Jackson, I know how you feel. Most parents, like your neighbors, the Carters and the Thompsons, felt the same way too. I wouldn't want you to get them if your kids wouldn't use them. But here's what Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Carter both said." That's how a great salesperson answers the real spoken objection. One summer on the book field, I called on Mrs. Craighead of Farmville, Virginia. She was an older woman and her family was grown. I showed her a family Bible and she loved it. When I told her the price, I thought she was going to throw me out. She hit the roof. Then I learned this very important point. Every objection does not equal a no sale. Mrs. Craighead shook her head and said, "That Bible is just too expensive." But then she paused for a minute and added, "But I always wanted a nice family Bible." Well, I got her check and she got her family Bible. Not every objection is a reason not to buy. You know, many people have something called a buying ritual. If you want to have some fun, go to the grocery store and watch people pick up the same item 2 or 3 times before they put it in their carts. Now, why do they do that? They have a ritual to their purchasing. They're going to buy Jiffy peanut butter, but they're still going to look at it several times and examine other brands as well before they commit to it. Sometimes people have to object just to fulfill their buying ritual. When someone buys your product and you pat yourself on the back for handling the objection so very well, realize that the prospect was probably going to buy your product all along and was just making you go through their buying ritual with them. Sometimes the prospect is also just testing your commitment to the product and the process. He intends to buy, but he wants to make sure you deserve it. These rituals are very difficult to detect, and if you make a mistake, you'll likely lose a sale. So I say, why bother trying to determine if prospects have such a ritual? Just treat it like a real objection and see it as practice for the really tough ones. The last type of objection is the one that is unspoken. You know intuitively that the prospect is not telling you the real deal. You just can't get the prospect to talk to you, or the objection doesn't make any sense. In either case, you need to invite the objection. Yes, invite it. This is done through a very direct question that gets you to the truth behind the prospect's hesitation. To get the full benefit of this, realize where the prospect is mentally and where you may have been in similar situations when you were being sold something. The reason the prospect is not forthcoming with the objection is because he doesn't feel comfortable telling you. Yep, it's your fault. For some reason, he is not telling you the real deal. Your progress comes to a screeching halt, and you can go nowhere in the sales process because you don't know where the prospect is. So how do you get there? To the point that the prospect feels comfortable enough to give you his real objections? No matter what I'm selling, it seems that there is a time at the end of the presentation when I'm packing up. Obviously, if I haven't answered the hidden objections, it's time to wrap it up and pack it up. At that time, the prospect's defenses are the lowest they will ever be in the sales process. The prospect has won, and he's beginning to relax. The defensive wall is coming down. This is when I say this: "Mr. Jackson, what is it that bothers you most about my product?" Another example: "Based on what you've told me, I can't see why you wouldn't want to do this. What am I missing?" These very direct questions at this precise moment often reveal the real objection. If it works, you can then pause and begin reselling. No one said you couldn't unpack if you can re-engage the prospect. Once you've gotten the real objection out, you can answer it. Use the same method that I described before for the real spoken objection, the feel, felt, found technique, the use of names, and third-party examples. Here are some common answers to objections that sales organizations I've worked with have used. The objection I hate the most, no matter what I've sold, is this: I want to think about it. I hate this, yet I've told salespeople trying to sell me something this very objection. Duh. Here are some answers to this, and again, remember to memorize a couple of answers to each objection so you have your tools ready. Mr. Jackson, I know how you feel. Lots of our customers have felt the same way before they bought. But here's what they found. Mr. Smith said this, I'll never know more about the product than I do right now. And I guess I have all the information I need to make a decision. One thing I want to mention is this, and then I would resell the product and then use my second obligating question. So what I'd like to do is get some information from you and get started. I'd reach for something that I needed to fill out and I'd complete the sale. Here's another answer to the I want to think about it objection. Mr. Jackson, I know how you feel. A lot of our customers felt that way before they bought. Usually when a customer tells me he wants to think about it, that means there's some problem with the product that he wants to think about. Do you mind me asking what that might be? This is a more direct approach that invites the objection, the real objection, and then you can better deal with it. Another objection most salespeople hear in their careers is the price objection. Most customers don't say the price is too high for the product or service you're selling unless a competitor is involved. So there really are only two types of price objections. One, I can't afford it, or two, your price is higher than the competitor. Both are price objections, but very different. Let's start with the I can't afford it objection. The prospect is really saying, I don't want to trade my money for the value I see in the product. If you've done a good job qualifying your prospect, you know they can afford it. Mr. Jackson, I know how you feel. A lot of people who've bought our product felt the same way at first. However, here's what they found. Although the initial investment may seem high, the long-term rewards are tremendous. Then explain your benefits and ask the obligating question. Based on that, Mr. Jackson, I'd like to go ahead and get started. That is said as you're reaching for something to fill out or your order book. Can you give me some basic information? Another more direct approach is this. Mr. Jackson, I know how you feel. A lot of people felt that way before they bought. Mr. Stevens said, it's not that I can't afford it, it's more that I'm just not sure it's worth it. Here's why he bought. He thought of the purchase price as a one-time pain that would bring years of pleasure. You know, we have customers that, and then you tell your story, and you come back and ask the obligating question. With that in mind, I'd like to get your order. You reach for the paper. Can I get some basic information from you? There are lots of catchphrases when it comes to price. Here are a few. Mr. Jackson, most of us spend that much on X each day, week, or month. Mr. Jackson, as hard as you work, you deserve this. Mr. Jackson, I'd rather explain the price once than explain the quality of the product for its life. You can think of them as well as I can. Write yours down and memorize them. Once I loved a pair of lamps, but they were very expensive. I was about to pass on them when the salesperson said, "It won't change your lifestyle, will it?" I told him no, but I just had never spent that much on lamps. The salesperson picked up the lamps, positive body language, and said, "I'm sending these home with you," as he walked to the register. He closed on resistance with a power question. Get yourself your own power questions. How about the competition's price is cheaper objection? Simple translation. Your price is too high. Well, to that you say feel, felt, found, and then you answer. Mr. Stevens found that on an apples-to-apples basis, we were actually a better value. Don't say cheaper. Mr. Stevens found that although the initial price was higher, the long-term costs were actually lower with our product. Here's how. Don't say, well, I guess my competition knows what his product is worth. I've actually heard salespeople say that. Here are some other thoughts when this objection comes up. What is more important to you, price or quality? Don't you want both? If the prices were the same, would you choose our product? Do you feel like both products are equal except for the price? These approaches isolate the objection so you can answer it, or they let you know the real objection. My last piece of advice about answering objections at the close of the sales presentation is to memorize answers to the most common objections and use them. There is another place you will hear objections, in the approach. Over the phone during your initial approach is a good place for your prospect to get rid of you. I've noticed over my career that lots of different products that prospects have their own unique points of resistance in the sales process. The hardest doors to get in were the easiest sales. They had no sales resistance, they knew it, and that's why they were so tough in the approach. Other prospects will listen to every salesperson only to say, "We'll think about it," or "I have to talk to someone else." Some will even sign an order thinking they can cancel later. It is important to be prepared for an objection in the approach. Usually this objection is, "What are you selling?" in one form or another. You can't ignore this objection, but you can be less direct. For example, use this in response to that objection. "Mr. Jackson, it's a program designed to increase fee income, cross-sell your services, and improve retention." No pause. "Like I said, I'll be in your area on Tuesday. Would 9 or 11 work for you?" I answered the question and closed for the appointment. The phone approach is designed to get the appointment, not to sell or explain the product. Of course, if you are in telemarketing, that does not apply to you, so just keep giving your sales talk. If you're going for the appointment, this is how you do it. In person, if the prospect says, "What are you selling?" you do the same thing. In the book business, I said, "What I'm doing is showing something to all the families with children. Your children go to Greenwood Elementary, don't they?" The prospect said yes, and then I continued, "Fine, may I come in?" And I wiped my feet as a positive body action as I leaned towards the door. Another phone objection I've often heard was, "You need to see someone else." Here's my answer to that. "Fine, Mr. Jackson, I'll be glad to meet with whomever you want me to." Now he's won, and you've created a buying atmosphere. However, my experience suggests that I meet with the CEO for about 10 minutes, and then if you think it has merit, I can meet with someone else. Without pause. Would 9 or 11 on Tuesday morning work for you? Alternative of choice. The key to answering phone objections during the approach is to be confident and to know what you're going to say. A stumbling voice gathers no appointment. No matter what I've sold, I had canned phone approaches and I practiced them in training. Before I would turn a rookie salesperson loose, I had him speak the phone approach repeatedly. My first summer selling books, I had trouble getting into houses the first week. When I showed my manager my approach at the end of the first week, he said, "No wonder you're not getting it. You're saying way too much." Here's what he taught me, and it worked. "Hello, Mrs. Carter. My name is Tom Black. I've just been out in the neighborhood calling on all the families with children. May I come in?" I know why it worked. The simplicity and directness were critical. I expected to come in, they sensed it, and when they objected, I was prepared and gave the answer I mentioned before. The second key is to remember the approach is your way of getting permission to give a presentation, not to give the presentation. A general rule of thumb to keep in mind about the approach, the less said, the better.